priests have been around for almost as long as time itself, and in that time, millions of people have confessed their sins to them. But what about the priests? Have you ever wondered what kind of dark secrets they could be hiding? Welcome back, everyone. My name is Kennedy, and today on Most Amazing, we are back with part 2 of the top 10 dark confessions from priests. So let's get started. Starting us off at number 10 is David Love. Not only was David Love the pastor of the New Hope Baptist Church in Independence, Missouri, but he was also the friend and trusted confidant of Randy Stone. Or at least that's what Randy thought. Reportedly, Randy had been having marital issues with his wife Teresa, and so he often confided in Pastor Love, whom he trusted to provide thoughtful guidance to his issues. But little did Randy know, Pastor Love and his wife Teresa had been having an affair for the past 10 years and were plotting against him. The plan came to a head in 2011 after Teresa found Randy shot to death with his own gun in his office. And then, following the plan, they held the funeral shortly after, where of course David performed a heartfelt eulogy for his dear friend. However, shortly after the ordeal, David Love moved, or rather fled, to South Carolina, which aroused suspicion, and the police soon learned of the decade-long affair he'd been having with his so-called best friend's wife. As it turns out, Teresa had shared the passcode to the safe where they kept the household weapon, and the plan was to kill Randy and collect the insurance money. In the end, both Pastor Love and Teresa pleaded guilty to the crime and were sentenced to life and 8 years in prison, respectively. Coming in at number 9, Pope Stephen VI. Now, there are a lot of crazy things that the church has done, but this one just seems highly illogical above anything else. Back in 897, Pope Stephen VI, along with the help of the Catholic Church, actually put a dead man on trial. The trial was for his predecessor, the deceased Pope Formosus, and the successor, Pope Stephen VI, held it, accusing him of usurping the papacy. He had been already dead 7 months by the time he was put on trial, but nonetheless they wanted to go through with it. They even assigned someone to speak on the dead Pope's behalf. Unsurprisingly, not being able to stand up for himself, he was found guilty, and all his acts as Pope were declared null and void. His body was stripped of his sacred garments, and they cut off 3 of his fingers of benediction. From there, he was cast into the river, the place where all infamous criminals were disposed of for centuries. Now, he very well may have been a fraud who deserved the guilty verdict, but I mean, he was already dead. It's not like he was gonna come back and cause a ruckus amongst the church now, was he? Coming in at number 8, Pope Leo X. Now, this man was not a killer, or at least not that we know of, so compared to the other people on this list, he's definitely not as evil, but still he is widely considered one of the most convoluted popes the Catholic Church has ever seen. Pope Leo X served as the head of the Catholic Church from 1513 to 1521, and in this time he funded some of the Renaissance's most famous artwork. However, this taste for the finer things in life came at a cost, and eventually his spending habits drove the church's finances deep into the red. In an attempt to balance the books, he decided to start heavily relying on indulgences, which are essentially convincing members of the church to fork over money to buy forgiveness for their sins, which is just as icky as it sounds. This pay-for-penance scheme angered many, including Martin Luther, who challenged his practices with 95 Theses pamphlet, which in turn sparked the Protestant Reformation. Now, again, as far as evil goes, this guy is not the worst on the list, but he was also probably not the greatest guy either. Next up at number 7 is John Nelson Canning. During the mid-80s, John Nelson Canning, a Pentecostal minister from Maine, was forced to move to South Florida after being accused of embezzling funds. And already we're off to a not-so-great start. Once he arrived in Florida, he became the minister of a small, non-denominational church called the Fountain of Life Church, which had only about 50 members in total. Now, 2 of the founding members of this church were Leo and and Hazel Gleese, an elderly couple in their 80s who Canning actually married in 1988. However, as one would suspect, a few years later in 1994, the couple's health became a concern, and so Canning, their minister, promised to take care of them for the rest of their days. This sounds sweet until you find out that the catch of this deal was that he got their power of attorney, and from that point forward he really began to abuse his position. Just as he had done before, he started embezzling money from the elderly couple. However, he stole so much so fast that later that year, Hazel confronted him after she realized tens of thousands of dollars were missing from their accounts. The minister, however, was determined to silence the victims, and so a few weeks later he snuck into their home and killed them in their sleep. Disturbingly, unfazed by what he did, he went out for dinner with friends afterwards and even provided a 30-minute eulogy at their service, saying that he was so close to the couple he would call them mom and dad. But eventually he was found out and arrested by police, pleaded guilty to his crimes, and was sentenced to life in 1996. Next up at number 6 is Ryan Erickson. On February 5th, 2002, a random perp entered a funeral home and shot and killed the director and his intern. But the strange part of the whole thing was that nothing was stolen, which led police to assume that the motive had to be personal between the perp and the victims. Finally, after 3 years of investigating, the suspicion fell on the local Catholic priest, Ryan Erickson. Unlike the others on this list, Ryan did not truly come forward and confess to these crimes. Starting in 2015, police began interviewing him as a suspect, but shockingly, after the second interview, Ryan took his own life and detailed in his note that he had never killed anyone. However, following his death, evidence was presented to a judge who ruled that he had, in fact, committed the crimes against the funeral director and his intern. But that's not all. It was uncovered that the reason behind the attack was that the director of the funeral home had discovered that Erickson had been committing other lewd crimes, the kind that could have landed him in prison for life. And so it's believed that Erickson killed the two men to keep his reputation safe. Coming in at number 5, the case of Sister Abhaya. 30 years ago, 19-year-old Sister Abhaya awoke at 4 a.m. to begin her studies at the convent. Before starting her day, however, she went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. Nothing unusual, except that the next person to walk into the kitchen found the fridge was left open, there was a huge spill on the floor, a slipper was wedged under the fridge, and most concerning of all, no one could find Sister Abhaya. A search began almost immediately for the young nun, but it didn't take long before they found her at the bottom of a well. However, despite that the young nun was found covered in bruises, cuts, and abrasions, it was ruled that she took her own life, and the story remained a solved and shut case for 16 years. That was until nuns at the convent finally petitioned for them to reopen it. And wowie, was it more complicated than originally thought. During the second investigation, 3 individuals became suspects: Father Jose Puthuru Kiel, Father Thomas M. Couture, and Sister Sefi. And as it turns out, the young nun had not taken her own life. Apparently, she had accidentally caught the 3 members of the church in a compromising position, and in a state of panic, they struck her on the back of the head with the blunt side of an axe before dumping her body down the convent well. After another 12 years, the trio were finally sentenced to life imprisonment for their actions. However, only 2 years in, they were granted bail and their sentences were terminated by the High Court. Coming in at number 4, Mike Tabb. In 2002, former Navy man Mike Tabb and his family moved to a small town in Texas after Mike was hired to be the new minister for the town's Methodist church. From the outside, he had a picture-perfect family, but the truth was far more tragic than anyone could have predicted. Soon after their arrival to the new town, the sheriff's department got a call from the town minister in a panic, saying that someone had broken into their apartment and badly beaten his wife, and so the police rushed over to the scene of the crime. But when they arrived, they discovered that Marla was more than badly beaten. She had been bludgeoned to death, so badly that her face was beyond recognition. As they searched around the apartment, they noticed that there had been some kind of struggle. One of the table legs was missing, which they assumed was the weapon used against Marla, but strangely, the crime scene seemed like it had been cleaned up already, which added to the authorities' suspicion that something wasn't adding up quite right. They decided to take some of Mike Tabb's clothes for testing, and to their horror, they discovered the blood matched that of his dead wives, and it was all the proof they needed to bring him in. The following year, in 2003, the minister pleaded guilty to the crime and was sentenced to 55 years in prison for what he had done. Coming in at number 3, John David Terry. The year was 1987 when Reverend John David Terry, who had already secretly stolen $30,000 from the church, felt trapped in his life and decided to hatch a plan to start over. The plan was simple, but incredibly illegal. Reverend John David Terry was going to attempt to fake his own death by killing another man so as to evade paying the money he owed to the church and give him the chance to start a new life. So on June 16, 1987, he lured the church handyman into the church attic, and once he was there, shot him in the back of the head. Once the poor victim had died, the Reverend stripped him of his clothes before putting his own clothes on the victim, and then to ensure that it would be harder to determine the dead person, he hacked off the man's head and a part of his arm, along with any body parts containing tattoos. And as if that weren't crazy enough, John David Terry then planted false clues using the victim's fingerprints to make it appear as though the handyman had killed him. And lastly, to finish off his evil plan, he set fire to the church. However, as fate would have it, the fire was put out before it could do too much irreversible damage to the corpse, and therefore the medical examiner on the case was able to determine that it was, in fact, not the body of the Reverend. Incidentally, 2 days later, John David Terry turned himself into the authorities, and after 2 long trials, it was eventually decided that he would be sentenced to death. Coming in at number 2, Jozef Tiso. There are a lot of pieces to the puzzle that led up to World War II, and during the rise of a certain World War II army group, sometimes we forget that they didn't do all that evil alone. Without going into a full-blown boring history lesson, prior to the World War, Germany was already sort of at war with Czechoslovakia, and in 1938, a selection of both Allied and Axis countries agreed to the Munich Agreement, which annexed parts of Czechoslovakia and eventually led to the creation of the Slovak Republic. Now, you might be wondering what the hell all of this has to do with a priest. Well, as it turns out, this new puppet state, of course, needed a president, and who else better to take power than a Catholic priest, Jozef Tiso, who just so happened to be a vocal supporter of what was going on in Germany at the time. During his time in power, which was only the length of the war, he spewed the same hatred and anti-Semitism that was coming out of his neighboring country and implemented hateful legislation, deported the Jewish people to death camps, and defended all of his evil actions wholeheartedly. But thankfully, once the war ended and Slovakia was liberated, he was tracked down, found guilty, and executed for his crimes on humanity in 1947. And last up in our number 1 spot, Oliver O'Grady. When it comes to seriously messed up dudes, this guy is one of the worst there is, and while I can't really go into detail about what he did, I am sure that you can put the pieces together on this one. Oliver O'Grady is an Irish Catholic priest who spent most of his career in California, starting in the early 1970s. And during this time, he committed countless illegal acts on vulnerable members of his church. By 1993, he was convicted of lewd acts and sentenced to 14 years in prison, and his victims were to receive a settlement of $7 million for the harm that was caused. However, only 7 years later, O'Grady was paroled and deported back to Ireland. Later in 2005, a video deposition showed O'Grady confessing to having 25 victims in California alone, a number that tragically is thought to be much higher if you include his victims from Ireland. But the sickest part was what was revealed in a 2006 documentary entitled Deliver Us from Evil, where O'Grady was the main subject. In it, he says he wanted the film to serve as the most honest confession of his life, and he details the crimes he committed and how he preyed on his victims, but also how the church knew all along, and that they would simply move him to a different parish anytime things became heated. Several years later, he was sentenced to 3 years for possessing explicit content. Then in 2020, O'Grady was back in jail for the same offense, this time for only 22 months, which is insane to me. Well, there you have it. That's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of Most Amazing's newest content. See you next time.